Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. We are this evening exploring the different denominations in Judaism, how they got founded, what are some of their core essential beliefs, teachings, how they've evolved over time. And my name's Kavod Wieder. I'm the Rabbi of Temple Bethel of South Orange County. And what I want to just start with is a little bit of history, because really the denominations are something that really began in the 19th century. They're not that old in the wider span of things. It really was a response to a huge movement across the world, which we know as in Hebrew as the Haskalah, or in English as the Enlightenment. And this was the period of time, 19th century Europe, especially, where all of a sudden there was this great intellectual awakening. With that intellectual awakening of rationality, of being able to recognize that in some sense, many different all different kinds of human beings have value, Jews began to have a different relationship to the rest of the world. For the very first time, Jews were able to participate in society in as far as hold jobs, attend universities, be able to participate in society in the way that everybody else could. And this was this whole kind of blossoming of consciousness and thinking. And what that really meant in many ways was the Jews came out of the ghetto, where because of anti-Semitism, because they were not invited into society in full participation, they kept to themselves, and they had their own self-governing. Their rabbis and were the ones who governed their community and each of the individual communities. And they really had to do things on their own. But as soon as the Enlightenment hit and they were able to participate, it became a new relationship for Jews to the world and to Judaism, because now they, for the first time in life, got to participate in a whole new world. And it was really exciting for the Jewish people. And what ended up happening was that many Jews did not want to have anything to do with what now was these antiquated practices of Judaism, these practices of kashrut, of dietary laws, of not being able to work or participate in with the rest of community on Shabbat. These were all practices that kept them separate from the rest of the world. And they didn't want to be separate anymore. They finally got a pass in, and we got a pass in. And so much of the response was to ditch it. And so there were two kind of primary responses that of the Jewish community to this new movement. One of the responses was what we know as the Reform movement, which is to say that we've got to, the original Reform leaders said basically, we've got to preserve our tradition. And the only way we're going to be able to preserve our tradition is if we change our tradition in a way that Jews can fully participate in society. They can't be in a place where they have to make a choice to say either I stay religious and live in the ghetto, or I ditch everything. They had to find this way to balance both. And so the Reform movement was born. One of the main original visionaries, Samuel Holdheim, of the Reform movement, lived between 1806 and 1860. He was one of the image that he used is, he said, we've got to remove the kernel from the husk, the kernel being like what's essential about Judaism, its beliefs, and what's the husk, all of the practices, the things that Jews do religiously. How do we take that away? So a lot of what these major changes that really marked the birth of the Reform movement in Europe was services in German as opposed to just Hebrew, so people could understand what was going on. There was a modeling of services to look very much like the Protestant services that that went along with it. Things like everything that we know now, like when we come to temple and we sit in the seats and the rabbi and the cantor are up front and that's a very Protestant model. Before that, it looked very different. It was the prayer leader was in the center of the congregation, facing forward, and everybody was facing forward in prayer and davening in Hebrew, praying in Hebrew, and everybody kind of won. And that change was really started with a birth of the Reform movement to say, we want services to look like everything, like our neighbors. And to be able to fit in. And there was another really key development as far as that the Reform movement made in order to keep Jews connected to Judaism, which was to say that Judaism is a religion, not a nation. Okay, this is a really key piece. When I say Judaism is not is a religion, a lot of us think, when we think about Judaism, we think about it as a religion on par with, with Christianity or Buddhism or any of all these things. That was a new development in the 19th century. Judaism was never looked at as a religion before that innovation of the Reform movement. It was looked at as that we're a nation, we're a people, almost maybe even an ethnicity. We're a people. It's not just a set of beliefs. It's a culture. It's a family, and basically, what all of that really said is, and we know this because if you're born Jewish, you don't have to believe anything in order to be Jewish. Religion is so much defined by belief, but you don't have to believe anything. Your mom's Jewish around the world, you're Jewish. That's how it always was, regardless of what you do or you don't do or any of that, because you're part of a people. Now, the thing about being part of a people is it makes you different from everybody else. And that was one of the things that the Reform movement was really seeking to say, in order for Jews to participate fully in society, Jews can't be so different from everybody else. We are human beings, obviously, like everybody else. And we just have a different set of beliefs and practices, a different religion. And so Judaism becoming a religion. Now, part of it becoming a religion also meant that in the creation of the Reform movement was the disconnection and this almost severing from the state of Israel. So now the state of Israel was not something that the Jews and I'm talking the early Reform movement, had any kind of obligation to, because being Jewish is not about peoplehood anymore. So now whatever the state of Israel does or doesn't do, because having some kind of connection and alliance to the state of Israel means that as Germans or later Americans, we might have dual loyalty. We want to be able to be committed to the country that we're in. And it certainly gets complicated if suddenly we have an interest with and an alliance with another country. So that was one of the responses, was the Reform movement to this enlightenment and this assimilation. And I think it's really, really important for us to understand that so a lot of the times the Reform movement looks and is viewed as a watering down of Judaism, because we see the Reform movement and we see that, that maybe there's not a whole lot of demands or requirements as far as Jewish practice. But it's really important to understand that the whole birth of the Reform movement was not about watering down Judaism. It was about keeping Jews Jewish. in a world in which they were for the first time given an opportunity to participate fully, and we were losing Jews. So that's an important insight. The second main response that happened to the Enlightenment is what we would call the Orthodox movement or the Neo-Orthodox movement. And I want to say it this way because a lot of people have the belief, and it's really the belief that Jews before the Enlightenment, before the Reform movement, were all Orthodox. And I want to suggest that that's not true. And part of it is defining what Orthodox means, that and what it means, what it meant then and what it means now. Up until the time of the Enlightenment, Jews were just Jewish, and being Jewish meant a traditional form of practice, and that those traditional forms of practice were not uniform. Even within the whole Ashkenazi Eastern European world, there were different, even though there were a lot of similarities in practices, you really followed what the rabbi of your community said and did. So you had a lot of different rabbis in different communities that, at least in Ashkenaz or in Eastern Europe, had lots of similarities of practice, but lots of customs and things that were different. And when you wanted to know what to do, you wouldn't just consult the Jewish texts, you would also consult the rabbi. And that was in Ashkenaz, but then there was Mizrach, there was the land of Israel and the Middle East, and they had their own ways of doing things and practices. And then there was Sephard or Sephardic, or places like Spain and everywhere from the expulsion that could go to Turkey or Rhodes or Greece. And they had their own kind of practice. So there was no uniform practices that one could call Orthodox in the same way. But people were traditional in the way that they understood being traditional. What I think it's fair to say, though, is that up until the Enlightenment, all Jews kept to their own communities and their own ghettos. So when it opened up and suddenly Jews could be a part of everything, certainly there were people that said, we don't want to be a part of everything. And you could say was the creation of orthodoxy. We consciously want to stay in our tight communities and do things and not let in the outside knowledge and wisdom of the world, lest it corrupt us. But there was also a movement called what we might call neo-orthodoxy, which was a movement, and its main proponent was the great Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who really just said that Jews needed to be able to participate in mainstream society, but they had to have even stricter rules about their own Jewish practice, that Judaism could not change. And this is something that all throughout Jewish history and life, and we're going to look at this a little bit later, Judaism has always evolved and changed to meet the needs of the current generation. And in fact, a lot of the great 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century texts of the Talmud really shows the teachings of the rabbis in the Talmud are very much about multiple opinions, and that certain opinions about how to be Jewish and do things Jewishly may be valid for one generation, but not valid for the next generation. So there was this real understanding in Jewish life and in Judaism that the halakha, or Jewish law, was something that could evolve and needed to evolve in time. But with the creation of what we call neo-orthodoxy, that process of evolution cut to a halt. And now, and the reason why it did is because it was a response not only to Jews leaving Judaism, which was something that was threatening in itself, and Jews who wanted to participate in the wide world, but also this whole reform movement that was going on that was now changing things. And we're going to talk a little bit about, some of the things that also characterized the reform movement, but they were radical, radical changes. And those changes were incredibly scary to the neo-Orthodox. And so the sense was, now we cannot afford the luxury of looking at Judaism as a dynamic, evolving, changing tradition in a sense, but now we need to clamp down and say, this is the way it is. Because if we don't, it's going to turn into something that's not Judaism anymore. So these were kind of these main pieces. Now, I'm going to go back for a moment to Reform Judaism. So there were a couple of major elements that really boosted this Reform philosophy that was coming in the 19th century. One was the founding of Hebrew Union College in 1875. And this was training a whole new group of rabbis to be able to minister to and to serve these new enlightened communities where people were participating in wide society. And again, how to operate in synagogues that looked like Protestant churches with organ music, mixed choirs, mixed men and women, which was a huge thing. And all of this was developing and was going very strong until something happened in the ordination ceremony of the first group of Reform rabbis in 1883. And this was in Cincinnati. I should say by this is that one of the things that was also very much characterizing the teaching of the Reform movement, and as it was articulated in the first Reform Rabbinical Convention in 1844, way before even the birth of Hebrew Union College, was that what Samuel Holdheim was talking about as the kernel that needed to be taken out of the husk was the kernel was the tradition of the prophets. It was prophetic Judaism. And by that we mean that the commandments or mitzvot, all of the things that we are obligated to do in relation to that being Jewish is all about. These are the commandments that originated at Sinai and were developed over thousands of years, that one could separate mitzvot into two categories. Mitzvot ben Adam lemakom, or mitzvot between ourselves and God. And those are all of the ritual mitzvot: prayer, study, observance of ritual. All of those things are about our relationship between ourselves and God and the community, and that's one section. The other section is mitzvot ben Adam lechavero, or mitzvot between a person and their fellow. And these are all the ethical mitzvot. Everything from being honest in business, to being kind, to charity, to opening the door from each other. Even smiling at another person is considered a mitzvah. So really this piece about what's our responsibility to each other, both part of the tradition. But what characterized the development of the Reform movement in the effort to keep Jews Jewish and not be separated from the rest of community was to say that we are only obligated in the ethical mitzvot between a person and their fellow, and not the ritual. And so with all of this came lots of things. It became a standard practice of Reform synagogues not to wear kippot, or ritual head coverings, not to wear talitot, prayer shawls, only the cantor or the rabbi up front leading the service wearing those things, and not to use Hebrew, and to use the vernacular, and what was taught and what was championed as as Reform Judaism at this time was the words of the prophets, the ethical piece. So now we get to 1883 and the graduation, the ordination banquet of the first Reform rabbis. And Isaac Mayer Wise, the rabbi who was head of the rabbinical school, specifically created a menu for this banquet in which every single item was high treif. When I say high treif, I mean the most not kosher of not kosher. We're talking pork, we're talking shellfish, we're talking, you know, milk and meat together. We're talking about the full bit. And there's a lot of writing and study about what all of that was about, but really what it was understood to be was that there was a struggle within the Reform movement at this time. There was a struggle between people in the Reform movement that wanted to hold on to more tradition and wanted to hold on to more ritual mitzvot, and those who wanted to jettison it and get rid of it. And it was almost considered to be a political move, or even to really say, this is who we are as a movement, and possibly even force those that were were causing some of the leaders, you know, conflict and struggle, not making it easy for the direction that they wanted to go. And so the defining moment was to create this treifa banquet. And what the result, if that was the desired result, it happened, because there were a number of rabbis that left the Reform movement to form what we know as the conservative movement. And let's see here. This was, we had really traditional Sephardic Jews. We had more moderate reformers like Marcus Jastrow and Alexander Kohat. And they basically said, this movement is going too far for us. We appreciate what it's trying to do, and we're behind trying to help Jews assimilate and be a part of, but we can't abide by this. The other piece that was a key historical piece that led to them breaking and founding the Jewish Theological Seminary, which we now know as the Conservative Seminary in 1887, was that there was a huge influx during this time in Jewish immigration to America from Europe in this. I'm sorry, I just realized that I was first talking about what the birth of the Reform movement in Germany, and then I switched over to America right away and talking about the founding of Hebrew Union College and Isaac Mayer Wise, but we're now in America, by the way. And the conservative movement was something that really came out, was a birth of American Judaism. So, so at this time, there was a huge immigration in from Europe of traditional Jews, what we would know as really Orthodox, as payas, beards, you know, covered heads, that kind of, think Fiddler on the Roof, you know, the pogroms and the things that happened in Eastern Europe that were suddenly influxing in. And it was interesting that there were a lot of Reform Jews, including these conservative founders, that said, you know, we need to find some way to integrate these Jews. There's no way they're going to go for this reform thing. So there were even Reform bankers, people who helped found the Jewish Theological Seminary, even as they weren't as traditional, because they really wanted to create this space for these traditional Jews to be able to come over. So, so the conservative movement was born, and this was an attempt to say, you know, we don't believe in this movement that that has arisen that we call neo-Orthodox, that's being called neo-Orthodox. We don't believe in this kind of clamping down of tradition. We still believe in this ever evolving nature of tradition, but we also feel like those ritual mitzvot are a core part of what it means to be Jewish, and we can't give that away. So how do we balance those two things? And that was kind of the birth of the conservative movement. So I'll just pause right here for a moment, because that's a lot of information. And to just tell you where I'm going, we'll just pause for some questions and comments to where we got up to in, almost 1900 here in history of the kind of the birth of these three movements. Now, where these three movements, I'll just say they have evolved in many ways over the years, as Sarah said, when even in her lifetime she's noticed, and we'll touch on that. And we'll also start to talk more in depth about the differences in these movements. We're going to also bring in, as we get historically, that really in the early 70s, we also had the birth of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and the birth of Reconstructionism that started with Mordechai Kaplan. It was kind of a branch out of conservative Judaism. And we'll also touch in the late 60s and 70s, which was the birth of something called Jewish Renewal, which is kind of almost considered another movement as well. So we'll get to all of those pieces. But for now, any questions, comments about the genesis of these three movements? You can just unmute yourself and...
Okay, I have a question. So yeah. Would we say that Reform started in Germany and conservative was, and they were Germans in the US, but conservatives was a result of Eastern European immigration? Is that what you were saying?
Almost. Definitely Reform definitely started in Germany. But the first rabbinic, but really blossomed in many ways through the founding of Hebrew Union College in America.
Okay.
But conservative Judaism was a response, like you're saying, not only to the new immigrants that were coming into America, it was an American phenomenon, but also to the fact that there was already a tension that was existing within the Reform movement.
Right.
And so really the founders of the conservative movement were part of the original Reform movement. They were part of that movement of people that said, we want to help the Jews assimilate into America and be a part of American culture and yet keep their Judaism. but could not go as far in the direction to do that as the rest of the Reform movement was going. Okay. All right. Well, onward. So okay, so let's talk a little bit about these. We mentioned a little bit, and I'm going to talk about Reform Judaism all the way until there was a couple of different big kind of moments in Reform Judaism. One was in 1975. It's called the Reform Rabbinical Convention then, and then even more again in 1999. These were two big major developments very recently in a lot of our lifetime within the Reform movement that we'll speak about. But before we get to that, well, I think it's really safe to say that all of these values that we spoke about of and current practice of seeing Judaism as a religion, of feeling only bound by the ethical mitzvot and not the ritual mitzvot, of being even against using Hebrew in services, and showing kind of outward signs of Jewish religiosity. These were all things that characterized the Reform movement. And there's one piece that also is a very core form of Reform Judaism that continues today, all the way here, which is the focus that Jewish law and practice is, and this is going to sound silly in our 21st century consciousness, but it is up to the individual to decide what kind of relationship they want to have with Jewish life and practice. It's the autonomous individual who gets to decide whether they want to keep Shabbat, whether they want to light Shabbat candles, whether they want to do any of this, that Jews are, from the Reform movement perspective, are not bound by Jewish law or communal standards or any of those things, but really as an individual, which very much characterizes our American culture, has their own choice of what they want to do. And that is a core aspect of the Reform movement as it started and as it comes up today. So now let's just switch for a moment and talk about the conservative movement. So part of what really distinguished the birth of the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1887 and the way that rabbis were trained all the way up into even my training at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies is this, what's called a positive historical approach to Judaism. And what that means is that Judaism and our Torah and our texts are something that we have to study and understand within the historical contexts in which these texts were written. So as opposed to the Orthodox perspective that sees whatever Rabbi Akiva said in the 2nd century, or whatever Rabbi Karo said in the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century, that those laws and those are laws that apply for all time. And, we should be doing the truest Judaism is to practice like they practiced back in the 2nd century or the 19th century or any of those things. The positive historic approach says that we need to look at what was going on historically at the time and understand that Jewish practice and law was something that was created as a response to those moments in time. And that is part of the nature of seeing Judaism as an ever-evolving perspective. I'm going to share my screen for a second, because a lot of what flows from practice, and we're going to talk a little bit into what it actually looks like on the outside, some concrete examples. But a lot of these ideas of Reform, conservative, Orthodox, all come from the understanding of what happened at Mount Sinai. That understanding of revelation. What does it mean that God revealed the Torah through Moses? What does that mean for our lives today? So I'm gonna try to share my screen here so you can take a look at this. Hold on one second. Okay, so let me see if I can make this bigger. All right. So I'm going to show you a grid or a spreadsheet that has a couple of different categories, and I just want to talk about those categories for a moment. One is the method of study. Okay, how should we study the Bible? Should we see it as the direct word of God, or is it a book written by human beings and therefore subject to historical, literary, and philosophical analysis like other books? These are questions concerning the product of revelation. So that's one thing we're going to look at. The nature of revelation. Where did the Bible come from? Revelation? If so, how should we understand that? What actually happened at Mount Sinai? If not, if the Bible didn't come from that experience, why did the men who write it call it the Word of God? And specifically, we do have to say the men that wrote it, because that was how it happened. Number 3, the authority of the Bible's laws and ideas. Is the Bible a special book for us because it carries the authority of God, or for some other reason? Okay, and the answer to this question will depend very much how we answer 1 and 2. And then finally, man or human's ability to change the Bible's laws or ideas. Does a person have the right or obligation to make such changes? And if so, how? The answer to those questions obviously depends on the answers 1, 2, or 3. Despite some variations, the Orthodox answer those 4 questions in one basic way, and the same is true for the Reform movement. There are distinct responses in the conservative movement. Okay, so let's look at what we have here. So the first is Orthodox. And the Orthodox, you'll see the method of study. There's no distinct between Peshat, the meaning that the author intended, and the Drash, the meaning given to the text by later tradition. For Orthodox, meaning of the text equals meaning that traditional commentators assign to it. All right, so this is really a key piece here. When we say Peshat, we mean the actual text itself. So when you read the Torah and you read the story of the Exodus, the Peshat, you read it that the story happened. It's the literal meaning, just like it was written. And when it says that Jewish law is a certain way, that's the way it is. However, Judaism is not just the Bible. Even Orthodox Judaism is not just the Bible. It's not just what the Bible says. It's how the classical rabbis, the rabbis of the 1st and 2nd century, 3rd, 4th maybe, interpreted, the traditional commentators, how they interpreted the Bible. So what it's from the Orthodox perspective, they say that the written Torah, the actual text of the Bible, and the oral Torah, which is the traditional commentary on the Bible, these 1st through 3rd century rabbis, that all of that was given at Mount Sinai. All of it. The written and the oral, meaning that everything that was going to be taught by the rabbis thousands of years later about how to interpret the text, that no, we don't really throw stones at people who violate Shabbat, which is what it says in the actual Torah itself. Somebody carries sticks on Shabbat, you stone them. Well, the rabbis of the 2nd and 3rd century said, no, it actually doesn't mean that. We're talking about a situation and they describe a situation that's almost impossible to happen because they're not comfortable with people being stoned for breaking Shabbat. What the Orthodox would say is that the rabbis of the 2nd and 3rd century that interpreted the Bible, the Torah, in a certain way that allowed nobody to throw stones on Shabbat, that this was actually the original meaning of the intention as it was given on Mount Sinai. They heard both the text, which had to be given and told in a certain way for certain reasons, but they also heard there was also the interpretation. So the interpretation of the text was passed down orally from generation to generation to generation until the rabbis of the 1st century and 3rd century actually wrote it down in the Mishnah and the Talmud. So for them, the method of study is if you want to learn about what the text means, you study the traditional commentators' interpretation of it. What's interesting is in the development of Orthodoxy, it started with Neo-Orthodoxy and this clamping down. I would say that probably the incredible blossoming of Orthodoxy in America really was due to an incredible marketing job. And the marketing job was from a major publishing house, which some of us know as Art Scroll. Art Scroll publishers, one of the biggest Orthodox, and I'll say Haredi, really ultra-Orthodox publishers, did an incredible job of making traditional texts accessible with incredibly great font, type print, organizing it in ways that people could understand, explanations, and really very easy fundamentalist interpretations of the text. And what Orthodoxy did through Art Scroll, which again was this idea that there's no distinction between Peshat, the literal meaning, and the Drash, was they would actually translate the original text of the Torah from the perspective of Rashi. Okay, so Rashi was great rabbi of the 13th century. And Rashi was, anybody who wants to know about Judaism should study Rashi's commentary on the Torah. And even though Rashi was one rabbi, what made him great was that he synthesized in his commentary many of the original midrashic traditional interpretations of the Torah. So you get to really know how the Torah was viewed by our traditional commentators through Rashi. But what's so important for the conservative movement and for the Reform is that if we want to understand the text and have a living relationship to the text, we have to be able to be open to other interpretations than the traditional interpretations. We have to see that the 10th century interpretations and the 18th century and the 20th and the 21st century interpretations in our day and age also are Torah and have validity and have something to say. But if the only way that I can be able to do that is if I have a translation of the original text that's truer to what the text actually says, and then have Rashi's commentary separate that I can look at and say, oh, that's what Rashi or the traditional commentators said. But if Rashi's commentary is actually interwoven into the very translation and not specified that it's interpreted according to Rashi, then I'm going to view the original text only through the eyes of the original commentators and not this incredible opportunity to have interpretation and dialogue and commentary, because the original text says this, when I'm really reading Rashi's interpretation of the original text, but Art Scroll doesn't tell me that. Before we kind of move on here, any questions, comments about this piece of Orthodox approach to revelation, to method of study? The other piece that I will say also, and again, this is what you're obviously what you're just getting from me is the perspective of a conservative Reform rabbi, duly affiliated. You might hear something else from an Orthodox perspective. But what I will say is the other reason why I believe that Art Scroll did an incredible marketing job around this is their subtitle was always Torah True Judaism. Torah True Judaism. So this also belief, and it's really a marketing message, that that orthodoxy is the way that Judaism always was, and is the truest form of Judaism, and everything else is just watered down or diluted or not as true, is also a response, obviously, to everything that's going on around the births and the flourishing of the liberal movements in Judaism, the conservative and the Reform and the Reconstructionist movements in Judaism. That with all of these different pieces competing there needed to also be to say, well, why pay attention to us? This is Torah true. And so, you know, a lot of when Jews look around and see ultra-Orthodox Jews with dressing like they dressed in 19th century Eastern Europe, there's a sense of this is more authentic. This is more authentic because this is how it was. And forget the fact that that was 19th century. We're not talking about dress that was in the 1st and the 2nd century. That would be a whole other thing to go back to, well, what's authentic Judaism? But, you know, but there's this sense of that because it seems like it's closer to the source. And that is really not the way that my understanding of the rabbis who formed Judaism, the Talmudic rabbis of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries that really laid down the foundation, saw Judaism in such a fixed way. Okay. So now we go to conservative, and I'm not going to go through all of these different things, but I'm just going to, this grid that you have comes from my teacher, Rabbi Elliot Dorff. And just in full disclosure, Rabbi Dorff is one of the luminaries of the conservative movement. So he doesn't have that much, we'll get to reform, he doesn't have that much to say about reform, but my presentation tonight of reform is not from his presentation of it. It's more from my own reading and study and understanding of reform theologians and all of that. But just to share these different perspectives within the reform movement. So the historical method is the same for all of these, and is studying the Torah. First of all, you distinguish between the Peshat, the literal meaning of the text, what was what was going on historically at that time, how could that be understood within its own time, and then look at the commentary or the drash separately and be able to analyze it that way. In this particular, there is this sense in the conservative movement of what's called continuous revelation, that God dictated God's will at Sinai and other times, and it was written down by human beings. That's why there's diverse traditions in the Bible. And one perspective here is that since the revelation was to Moses and was by far the clearest and most public, that was the most authentic recording of God's will. And from Sinai on, Jewish law and theology are to be identified with the ways in which the rabbis of each generation interpreted and applied the laws of Torah. So the authority of Jewish law is based upon the fact that it is God's will, as first stated in the Torah, and then by the rabbis of each generation. And the rabbis are authorized to modify the law for their time, but only with extreme caution. Okay, so there is a conservative perspective that is kind of the same as Orthodox. I'm going over to the very right box here, that really for the most part, you don't change, but you can change it here where there's clear borrowing. You see clear borrowings from other cultures. You can modify it where there's places that there's scribal error, but this is like conservative with a capital C, conservative one, capital C, that we really are not going to change the tradition unless we have to. Conservative 2 that he distinguishes is human beings. This is another continuous revelation, that human beings wrote the Torah, but they were divinely inspired. And human beings wrote the Torah at various times and places. Hence, there are diverse documents, laws, and ideas in the Torah. The people were, however, divinely inspired, and therefore their words carry insight and authority of God. Jewish laws and ideas may be changed for 2 reasons. First, since the Torah is a combination of divine inspiration and human articulation, we've got to distinguish the divine and human elements in the tradition and change the latter when circumstances require it. and divine inspiration didn't happen once or for all at Sinai. The Torah is the document on which Judaism is based, and it therefore has special importance for us. But divine inspiration continues on in the form of new interpretations of Torah in every generation. Okay, so here there's more sense that new interpretations are also divinely inspired, just like the older ones were. And when the changes are made, they must be made by the community. Okay, and if we go over to the side here, human beings can change them because the rabbis in every generation may be inspired to a new midrash, a new interpretation, and they must change because the rabbis of each generation are charged with the responsibility to keep Jewish law viable by balancing tradition and change. Okay, so in the conservative two perspective, because not only are the interpretations in every age divinely inspired, now there's more freedom to change the law and to change how we do things in every generation, because new revelation can happen in every generation, and therefore the change. Conservative 3 is that revelation is the disclosure of God, God's self. It's not a declaration of specific rules or ideas, but rather a meeting between God and human beings in which they get to know each other. This meeting is asserted for different reasons and described in different ways by the existentialist and objectivist thinkers of the group. In other words, there are variant understandings in the act of revelation. Both schools agree, however, on the nature of the text of revelation. The Torah is the record of how human beings responded to God when they came into contact with God. So revelation here, whether you're talking about the revelation at Sinai or the revelation that's possible for every human being in every generation, is an experience of God. And this is kind of it's called, Rabbi Dorff calls it the existentialists. We can also call it the mystics, in that these are where to say that one can have a revelation of an experience of God in every generation. And however, the texts that we write are our response to that revelation of God when we experience it. And Jewish law here, this is C, has authority for the Jew, both because it represents the attempt of the Jewish people to spell out God's will as revealed in the ongoing encounter with God, but also because Jews are members of a covenanted community and have obligations under that covenant to God and to the Jewish community of past, present, and future. The divine and communal aspects of Jewish law make it a series of mitzvot, commandments, and not just minhagim or customs, which we're going to see here is in contradistinction to the Reconstructionist position below. We're going to get into where Reconstructionist comes into in seeing a lot of these aspects of Jewish law as customs, minhagim, and not just commandment, mitzvot. However, since the Torah was written by human beings, if we want to learn about the origins and meanings of the Bible, we must use the techniques of biblical scholarship as thoroughly and honestly as we can. And it goes on. There's more that we can read here. But what I'll say about changing it is we continue to now I'm on the very right box. We continue to have encounters with God, and the law must be changed to reflect that new understanding of God's will that results from those encounters. It's the rabbis representing the community and not every individual on his own that must determine the content of Jewish law in our day. We're going to come back to this in the distinction between conservative and reform. But Reconstructionist as an outgrowth, and I'm going to touch on this in a moment, with what Rabbi Dorff calls conservative number 4, the Reconstructionist tendency, also comes in to say that the laws or the minhagim, or how we practice Judaism, is not decided by the individual, but decided by the community. And where this comes into the conservative movement is there is a branch of the conservative movement called the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, in which that when Jewish law is changed, it's done by a committee of 15, 16 rabbis that will propose a new change. They will write what's called a tshuva, it's really a response to a question that's basically saying, we have a new circumstance in our generation, a new way of doing things, and we need to adjust Jewish law to respond to it. How do we adjust it? And then there's a tshuva, which means answer, a response to that. And then the committee will decide, will accept or reject the tshuva, and they'll accept it and reject it on not only the merit of whether it meets a need, but whether it is that it has a certain continuity and is able to really honor the tradition as it goes before it, and is not throwing out major principles in Judaism. So that's a key feature here of conservative Judaism. I'm going to come right here to the Reconstructionist tendency, which was really came from Mordechai Kaplan, who was a conservative Jew and a teacher at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And some of the main proponents of Reconstructionism is Mordechai Kaplan, a conservative Jew. Also Harold Schulweis, who until just recently was the senior rabbi at Valley Beth Shalom in Encino. And he was ordained as a conservative rabbi, but was a main proponent of Reconstructionist way and theology. And even though he maintained his position as a rabbi of a conservative synagogue, one could say that he was a leader in the conservative movement, which is to say that there is a place for Reconstructionism within the conservative movement. So same kind of historical method as the rest. But here, the Reconstructionist movement is to say there is no revelation. There is no revelation. There's no claim for actual divinity of the product of Torah. It's human beings that wrote the Torah, human beings from their wisdom and their, you could say their inherent godliness. And I'm gonna, I'll say a moment about this in a moment. But the authority of it comes from human beings. And so here, communal authorities in each generation can and must help individuals reconstruct Judaism with current and meaningful customs and ideas, but observance of rituals is voluntary, like the Reform movement. An organized, creative community of the future could establish and enforce moral laws. So the pieces that it has, so one of the key elements of Reconstructionism that Mordechai Kaplan really coined is that Judaism is an evolving civilization. He talked about Judaism as a civilization. It's not just a religion. And the whole concept of the JCC, the Jewish Community Center, as a place for all Jewish life to happen, classes, spirituality, a pool, a gym, all the things that Jews as people come together with, comes from this place of Judaism as an evolving civilization. And many synagogues, and this is very key with Reconstructionism, will talk about a shul with a pool, a place where people can come to the synagogue not just for prayer, but for all kinds of things. We know, to play mahjong, to get together and do bingo, to do all of these other things. These are actually rooted in Mordechai Kaplan's innovations of Judaism as a civilization that then went and spread to all the different shuls, Reform, Conservative, all of these pieces. But the key pieces, I think that's really important here, Reconstructionism keeps that sense of conservative practice, conservative study, that we distinguish between Peshat and Drash, and we determine the Peshat through literary and historical analysis, that it connects with reform in that Jewish observance is voluntary, but it connects with conservative in that it's communal authorities in each generation that really are the leaders in helping individuals construct Judaism. So some of the ways that you will see this play out in Reconstructionist communities is that the prayer book, the Reconstructionist prayer book, Kol HaNeshama, has, I would say, so much of traditional components of practice. They don't throw out prayers because they don't seem applicable. And I'll hold a difference. I'll just juxtapose for a moment Reform and Reconstructionists in a moment. Reform looks at certain prayers in the prayer book that are problematic to our 21st century mind and gets rid of them. An example is the second paragraph of the Shema. Our Mishkan Tefillah prayer book does have the second paragraph of the Shema, but that's because we ordered a custom prayer book and we asked them to put that in there to serve our dually affiliated communities. And in fact, when we do Reform services, we will say the Shema and the V'ahavta, which is the first part of the Shema, but then we'll skip to the very end of the Shema with the Lama'an Tizkaru section, and we'll skip the section on tzitzit, and we'll skip the section on reward and punishment kind of aspect of that second piece. But there is an option to do that full complete Shema with that second paragraph in our Siddur. But most Reform Siddurim, most Mishkan Tefillah do not have that section. In the Reconstructionist prayer book, it has that section and includes that section. However, there are when the Reform movement Reconstructionist movement has aspects of liturgy that they find problematic, they will not get rid of it, but they will reconstruct it. So you will have a different prayer for the blessing that we say over Kiddush on Friday night, and a different prayer over different wording over the blessing over the Torah. I forgot the exact wording of the Reconstructionist, but in the blessing over the Torah and a corresponding theological component in the Kiddush, we say, "Blessed are you, God, Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim, who has chosen us from all the people." Well, that's kind of a problematic, can be a problematic thought. Jews, what does it mean that Jews are chosen from all people? And certainly there is a real problem that the Reconstructionist movement had with the idea that chosenness could be interpreted as being better than. So what they did, but they didn't get rid of the blessing, the Kiddush blessing, but they changed it. So it doesn't say Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Amim. It says something like, and if anybody knows it, please unmute and pipe up, but it's something about Krav Lanu, like who brings us close to the Torah. They changed the actual Hebrew of the liturgy to make it fit more with those theological sensibilities. Does anybody?
Rabbi, I put it in the chat.
Oh, wonderful. Let me just see here. Okay, let me find the chat. I have to go back to.
The Reconstructionist version of that phrase is rewritten as Asher Kravanu La'avodato, who has drawn us to your service by giving us the Torah.
Thank you, Wendy. Appreciate that. That's wonderful. Yes. So you can see that it's different here, and there's a corresponding kind of difference that's in the Kiddush blessing on Friday night, when there's a piece of us also being chosen from the people, from all the people. So very interesting enough, The reform movement doesn't change that section. We leave it in as is. So they're just different approaches to how we deal with practice, versus now the conservative movement will look at problems like that with trying to offer, they'll keep the original text that's in there, but then we'll offer commentary to try to explain in the issue of chosenness. Here are 2 or 3 different ways to understand chosenness that are not about us being better than anybody else. So, so those are ways that has that's played out. Reform. So here again, same historical method as the conservative. Again, viewing things as historical literary analysis, but there is a concept here that's different than conservative, which is called progressive revelation, as opposed to continuous revelation. Progressive revelation is that the Torah is God's will, written by human beings. Okay, so this kind of takes this in some ways. Now we're in line with conservative 1 and 2, conservative 2 and 3, that it's written by human beings. But as time goes on, we will get to understand God's will better and better. Progressive revelation. It's in a sense to almost say that the new openings and understandings are better than the old, that revelation continues to evolve and progress. And in this, we have that the moral laws come from God. Ritual laws have no authority because prophets canceled them. And the rabbinic laws were intended for specific periods only. And so now when we go to ritual laws, we have to look at what makes sense to our generation here and now. And every individual decides what and how we want to practice or obey. So in a moment, I'm gonna switch to talking a little bit more about conservative and reform specifically. Oh, I still also need to deal with renewal. So let me just talk about Jewish renewal for a moment, and then we'll pause for questions, comments before we talk a little bit more about conservative and reform today. So the Jewish renewal movement was something that was really the birth of Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who along with Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach in the 1950s came from Chabad tradition and was sent out by the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Yosef Yitzhak Schneerson, to do outreach or kiruv to college campuses, to go to college campuses and try to help connect college Jews back to Judaism. And as they went ahead and did that through the 60s, they were exposed to all of the culture of the 1960s in America, which included civil rights, which included psychedelic drug experiences, which included the influence of Eastern forms of meditation and other kinds of religious practice, that people were trying on and experimenting with all different kinds of things. And Rebbe Zalman, as I call him, he's one of my teachers, took it all in. He took it all in and basically created really, again, through his writing and through practices that began to evolve over time in the 70s and the 80s, that really began to influence, not only become a movement of its own, but began to influence all of the denominations. And really what characterized Jewish renewal was a real awareness and adoption of the current social trends that were awakening the awareness of sexism, racism, homophobia, all of the different ways in which Jewish tradition took on these characteristics of our broader society, that as from his perspective, did not affirm the divine presence in every human being. So there was a pull to create a new Jewish movement that was more fully egalitarian, that more sought a diversity of participation and experiences. There was a seeking of another characteristic of Jewish renewal was a real desire to integrate Kabbalah and Chassidut, Jewish mysticism, into Jewish practice, to say we have this very rich tradition of spirituality that all the young people right now and Jews are looking for as seekers for greater meaning. And we have this very rich tradition, and we need to make that available in accessible ways. So that became another aspect of Jewish renewal. And a third was that we have much to learn from other Jewish traditions, and that the truth is that Judaism has always been influenced by other Jewish traditions. Kabbalah was influenced heavily by Sufism, which is Islamic mysticism, and much of our Jewish tradition was also influenced by Christian thought and Neoplatonic thought, and so on and so forth. We can even go back to pagan, even early biblical religion was influenced by a lot of the pagan tribes that we call pagan tribes, but the neighboring tribes that were all around. So Judaism has always been influenced, and we should not be afraid of these influences, but instead should consciously seek to incorporate them, the wisdom that we see from them, and the ways that they are consistent with and can help broaden our Jewish perspective. So all of these, so Jewish renewal began to also train a new grade of rabbis, and continues to do that even today through an organization called Aleph. And there are new rabbis that are being ordained. They have a program of study in the same way. No one central place for a seminary. It's a lot of online and distance learning and retreats and that kind of thing. But there is a Jewish renewal movement. Okay, questions, comments about any of this as we look at it?
When did you say Jewish renewal was? The 60s and 70s? Is that what you said?
It was birthed in the late 60s with Reb Zalman Schachter Shlomi. The other piece that really helped, that became a very big influence in the Jewish renewal movement, was also the Chavurah movement. So the Chavurah movement that was really started, Michael Strassfeld and the Jewish Catalog, and Rabbi Art Green. All of these things was a lot of do-it-yourself Judaism, and instead of meeting in synagogue centers, meeting in Chavurot, and kind of trying on new kind of Jewish expressions. These were all part of what became this experiment in Jewish renewal that became more formalized later on.
I had a question.
Yeah.
A couple times it was mentioned that observance is voluntary. Does that imply that observance was required, and there would be like punishment, or what does that mean exactly?
That's a great question. And that's a great question. And that's a nice way for us to really distinguish between theory and practice. Really, when you're talking about the Orthodox and conservative movements, there is a real sense that Jewish tradition, Jewish law, is obligatory, meaning that if we are really believing that revelation, even as it develops and unfolds through human beings, and even as we believe that every community can interpret what that revelation looks like and how Jewish practice can happen through their rabbi, there still is a sense that to live a Jewish life, one needs to, it's not something that, I mean, look, obviously we all have free choice and we all choose whether or not we're going to, but there's a sense in conservative Judaism that to be a conservative Jew means to be trying to live your life in as much accordance with Jewish practice as it's articulated by the conservative movement today. It's whereas in the Reform movement, there is not that sense of obligation. That the Reform movement, and here's where we start to segue. Hold on one moment. Here's where we start to segue into how things are practiced, what Reform Judaism looks like today and what conservative Judaism looks like today, is that in 1999, the Reform movement came up with another platform called the Pittsburgh Platform of 1999. And in this platform and statement of beliefs, more than anything, the Reform movement articulated that we have this incredible depth of treasure of Torah, of Jewish learning, of Jewish practice, of mitzvot, that Hebrew and learning Hebrew and being able to connect to our tradition through Hebrew is important, that Israel and our connection to Israel and Judaism is not just a religion anymore, but Judaism is that we're part of a people. But all of these things were articulated in the 1999 Pittsburgh Platform. That was really to say that, that yes, Judaism is voluntary, but the Reform movement up until 1975, when there was another platform that was more positive as far as Jewish ritual observance, and now even more in 1999, beforehand, Reform was almost anti these practices, that all of these ritual practices were things that kept us from connecting to the larger society. And to be a Reform Jew really meant to kind of reject those practices. Now in 1999, the evolution of the Reform movement towards greater Jewish practice and observance and serious engagement in Judaism was one that was saying we have this incredible amount of treasure, and individuals are encouraged to learn Hebrew, are encouraged to connect to Israel, are encouraged to take on and try on new mitzvot and new ways of practice. But it's voluntary. It's the individual that decides. It's not community norms that hold out that expectation. And so, so that's a sense of voluntariness. Now, what's really interesting, and this is where we talk about theory and practice, I would say in our Temple Beth El community, that even as people that identify as conservative Jews prefer to have conservative worship services, that they really function much more as a Reform Jew, meaning that they don't have a sense of being obligated to engage in Jewish practice, to come to Jewish prayer services for the holidays or on Shabbat necessarily on a regular basis, or observe really, the conservative movement practices on Shabbat still, even as we do Saturday morning Zoom services, the conservative movement as a whole, as a klal, as a, is still not supporting or condoning doing certain services on Zoom. They're still looking at and saying there are many halachic ways this violates Shabbat. And yet, in practice, our community, even those that label themselves a conservative, are really taking a reform perspective to Jewish law. And that's neither here nor there. That's just who we are. But it's important in understanding the reform movement and the conservative movement as they look today, is that that's what these two things mean. We used to think that conservative Judaism meant more serious engagement with Judaism, more practice, more observance, more any of those things. And reform meant less. But now, the way the movements have unfolded in practice, that's not true anymore. We have lots of serious, engaged Reform Jews who do it from a place of voluntary, because it's meaningful to me as an individual. I don't do it because I feel obligated to. I do it because it's how I want to connect. And conservative Jews who also feel that same kind of voluntariness and not that same sense of obligation. Other questions, comments?
I was going to ask something similar to what Sarah asked, but I guess the direction that you took, it makes me wonder a couple things. One is, we've often talked about labels and not wanting to use labels. But if you are defined, we define ourselves perhaps as who our parents were or how we were raised. And yet, are the definitions, I'm hearing you say more accurately, by the way we practice? Mm-hmm. So that's part of the question. And then the other question is, there is somewhat of an irony, I think, of the need for a conservative group of people to feel they want to daven so badly together on a Saturday morning, we would break halakha to accomplish it because it's so important for us to do it.
Yeah.
It seems
right.
Somewhat...
Yeah, it's beautiful.
But can you speak to the issue of, are we really mislabeling ourselves because we're defining ourselves by how we were raised or whatever, or who our parents told us we were, rather than literally how our practice is?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And that's really a question about what do these labels actually mean? And we talked about this, when we were in seminary, in rabbinical school, about the difference between, how the rabbis practice or see conservative Judaism and how the laity, how people practice it. And it's very interesting, and this is kind of, the evolving of a movement. Right now, we really try to, Evan is really strong as the VP of Ritual, to really talk about that we are not, it's not so much that we are Reform or conservative Jews, but that we are Jews who prefer conservative or Reform worship. And that's a way of trying to talk about a little bit, at least at Temple Bethel, how do we experience ourselves as a community, and what are the ways that we enact our preferences and our identities in the community. And what we're really looking at here is that conservative and Reform, these are philosophies, these are approaches to Judaism. These are, as they have been articulated by the leaders of the movements, that's kind of what on one hand, it's the rabbis and the leaders of the movement that kind of define what that is on one hand. But then on the other hand, there's also the people that define what it looks like. And there is even precedence in Jewish law for Jewish law to change based on what the people do, not by what the rabbis say. And so I forgot exactly what, there's a term for it. There's a principle that I forgot of what it is. But you know, in a sense, there is a very valid halakha. Let's take the Zoom Shabbats for a moment. There's a very valid halakhic principle in which the conservative movement could go ahead and, if, you know, in the time of this pandemic, or conservative communities all over started doing these Zoom Shabbats, breaking Shabbat, that the leadership could actually go ahead and say, we're going to change our laws and expectations around how to observe Shabbat because of what the people are doing. But the piece is that ultimately what characterizes conservative is, it is what the community decides. But when we say community, we say Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael is not the community of our individual synagogue. It's the community of the conservative movement as a whole, you know. And so we have this tension and there's always been this intention between what the people do and what the rabbis and the leaders say. So in some ways, I would say, yes, the Zoom Shabbat is going against what the conservative movement is putting out. And on the other hand, it's exactly what is appropriate to the conservative movement, because this is part of how Jewish law changes, you know, which is that the people also do what they need to do and to decide. So I guess the only other thing I would say about that, Wendy, is, you know, I think the approach of labels is, what do labels serve? What is the purpose or the use of labels? A lot of the time, what I would say is that labels serve to establish boundaries. And the question, when we establish those boundaries, what are the purpose of those boundaries? What are we trying to accomplish by setting those boundaries? And I say that in a 100% non-judgmental way, that setting boundaries are really important to the preservation of our tradition, to the continuation of meaning and depth in our lives individually and as, you know, and as a whole. But it's a very important question to ask: what do boundaries preserve, and how do we use labels in service of that?
Maybe it's identity and belonging. People want to belong to something. And so in order to belong to something, you have to kind of do the who are we, or who am I? And then once you establish that identity or that belonging, then you sort of know which group you belong to, whether it's religion or anything, you know, whether it's you're a feminist or whatever the category is, or your political party, because you want to say, like, well, where do I fit in? Where do I, because you want to fit in to something.
Yeah.
So I guess it's maybe human nature to want to identify and fit in with some group.
I think that's a good point.
Expansionist.
I wanted to follow up on something that you had said, and Wendy had kind of prompted you into the conversation. And I thought back a while ago, I read off the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards about driving to shul on Shabbat. It was a long debated conversation, apparently. I wasn't there at the beginning of it, but it took a number of years for them to come to the conclusion that this committee, which I don't know if empowers the right word, but it's impaneled to adjudicate questions of contemporary halakha and how they apply to our lives, came to the conclusion that if we didn't allow people to drive to and from their synagogue, they wouldn't go, or too many of them wouldn't go, or it would be impractical for them to get there. And so they were able to analyze and lift up the question as to the level of participation and how to facilitate that at a higher degree or a higher number or not. And I mean, there's a whole, I remember reading it, it was everything from what is a fire and is the car in a fire, and, you know, and all these other things. But I see that as a fundamental difference between the conservative, for lack of a better term, movement, And the reform movement, what you said earlier is like, well, we're rugged individualists. And if we don't see a problem by deciding for ourselves whether we drive, drink, smoke, whatever on Shabbat, because we're individualists, whereas we have in the conservative movement in particular, and I sent you a quick question because I was thinking about this. We have a structure that we can come together and kind of see the debate and the thinking that resonates with some of the traditions and values that we are trying to maintain. And sometimes we struggle mightily with them. I know recently I didn't read all the information about going online during this pandemic, and there was a divergent set of views on this, and they came to some consensus on some things, and some, look, we're not going to have a consensus, but we're going to go okay for right now. I mean, but the thinking of how they massaged out the question was important to me, because I wanted to understand why I was doing what I was doing, why I'm hanging my hat the way I'm hanging my hat, as opposed to going, well, you know, I'm Ben and I can do what I want because I'm part of the Jewish people, which is true, but I'm also, it's not just, the word people is not exactly fully defined. I'm sorry to have taken so much time.
No. So that you brought up a lot of good points. And I would say, Ben, that, you know, your sense of I'm part of a people, and it's not, I don't feel like I want to just make the decision by myself. I want to understand, and I want to be a part of the process of coming to that decision as a community and understanding how a community wrestles with that. That's one of the characteristics that we can really call of conservative Judaism. You know, what you mentioned about driving on Shabbat, this was a tshuva that the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards in the conservative movement did in the 1950s, when Jews were moving out to the suburbs and needed to find a way for people to attend shul and keep together. This was, I mean, it's really commonly understood that the tshuva that was written for this was one of the worst tshuvot written of all time. And the reason why it was one of the worst is because it really was not able to draw on any real solid precedent to be able to say this is in accordance with halakha as it has come up through the ages, which is how a good tshuva is written. It's one that is able to call upon previous principles and then say this is how this applies in this day and age. But that tshuva of the driving tshuva, as it's called, was not, did not do that in a very cohesive way, and yet it passed and accepted. And it passed and accepted was because the law committee looked and said, there is such a need right here. We can't figure out how to make it fit. we can't figure out. We know that this is the way the world is. That people are going out and moving to suburbia, and we're not going to change that or whatever. And we need to preserve Jewish community. And so they passed it through anyway. It's kind of a statement of where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. But that's something that's very characteristic of conservative Judaism, in that it needed to be something that this group of rabbis, that this community as representing the conservative population, had to make that decision before people could have the permission to feel like they were still able to observe Shabbat and drive to shul. Would people have still driven to shul anyways? Probably. Even if they didn't have the position, they would still drive to conservative synagogues, just like there are Orthodox people that still drive to Orthodox synagogues. But they would not feel like they were observing the halakha. They would feel like they were outside of the practice and they were breaking it every time they did it. And that wasn't something that was going to keep people feeling positively connected. So, that's an interesting place where some people, you consider yourself a Reform Jew or feel like you really, for the most part, really resonate much more with that sense of voluntary choice. Like, I don't need permission. I don't need permission from any group of rabbis to determine what's going to be meaningful for me as far as observing Shabbat or not. I determine that. Well, that perspective, that's a Reform perspective. Other thoughts or questions? Yes, Carol.
Well, it was interesting to me when you brought up Rabbi Schulweis, because that was my rabbi. And I found it interesting when we moved here, because I always considered myself conservative, because that was my temple even before he came there. And but I always thought that you could do what you thought was appropriate, because I guess in my house growing up, my dad thought some of the rituals were like old things that his parents did that he didn't think were modern, and so he didn't do them. But there were other things that we just had to do. And so I didn't feel that there was any difference in Temple Beth El from Valley Beth Shalom that way, but it was more, and I was pleased that they did more Hebrew than I thought a Reform congregation would do. So I always thought that TBE was sort of a combination to me, even before the conservative joined. And I felt very comfortable there because it seemed very much like what I was used to, even though there were more things I could have done growing up than we did. But that was always, I thought, okay. I didn't think I wasn't observing something that I should be observing. It was just what we chose to observe.
Right, beautiful. That's the difference also between theory and practice. Right? The theory is that when you come to synagogue, that's not just the place where you are, where you're doing everything according to the book. Because in a conservative synagogue, just like here at Temple Beth El, even though we have a wide variety of people who observe, even people who identify as conservative, have a wide variety of what kinds of levels of kosher that they keep, if what they keep at all. We very much make sure that the meals that are connected to our conservative worship are fully kosher, like kosher to, even really to an Orthodox standard, but it's to a conservadox standard, let's put it that way. So that really anybody at the most, highest levels of kosher observant could be able to participate. But that's also a way we as a community try to make space for the variety of conservative practice. And I think what you're also speaking, though, the reality of your home, just like it is at most of people, I would say at Temple Beth El's home as well, is that it's a real variety of different practice and what you do and what you don't do, and all of those sense. But there are many conservative Jews who are much stricter, in their practice and their observance. There's the whole gamut, there's the whole spectrum. And a lot of that is, if you're really thinking about what you're doing and why you're doing it, of how much is connected to how you interpret Revelation, how you interpret what Jewish law is about, what you're obligated to or not obligated to, how you understand that really affects the choices that you make. The other thing, oh, Barbara.
Yeah, two things. Number one, I was wondering if there's a way for you to provide us, if we're interested, with that copies of that chart, because I found that very helpful. And through the discussion and what you were presenting, we've really had the wide perspective. As somebody said, it's the focus on preserving Judaism, however we do it, whether it was my late father-in-law, may he rest, who drove to shul but was very frum and everything, kept kosher, etc., to a grandfather on the other side who told my grandmother when they moved out to LA and he couldn't find good week, he says, okay to go to a non-kosher butcher. And she knew nobody, but she still looked around in the street corner. We tell this story because the first time she went into a non-kosher butcher shop, but she also kept up the family practices. To me, who participate more and more in both the conservative services at Temple Bethel of South Orange County, but also with my first Reformed synagogue in San Pedro, where I'm also a member. So I see both sides of it, but I feel that I have the freedom to choose, and yet it's that preserving Judaism, the things that I feel are important to me.
Beautiful. Thank you, Barbara. The other thing that I think is really important to mention about Reform and conservative is, is really the interpretation and the sense of Judaism as being what I guess as what we really call tikkun olam, making the world better, social action, social justice. This is something, obviously from the Reform movement, from its very birth, it really said what we are obligated to is not the ritual observance, but the ethical observance, and really looking to the prophets. And if you study the prophets, you are engaging in a study of spiritual social justice. That all of the prophetic books are completely about the prophets speaking God's word against power and commenting on the wider world and how we can create a more just society according to what God wants. That's what you're going to find in Isaiah and Amos and Jeremiah and all of the prophetic books. So to really take the prophetic literature seriously is to really be engaged in social action and social justice. And this is something that are very much part of the conservative and Reform movements today. We know in the Reform movement, there is the Religious Action Center, which is really a whole department within the URJ that's about thinking about social action and social justice and how we apply our values outside in the wider world. The conservative movement is constantly putting out statements about issues that are going on in the world today and where Jewish values stand on them. And of course, we know the legacy of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. For racial justice. And that Rabbi Heschel, as much of you know, was not just one of the greatest theologians of Judaism and the conservative movement. He was also a primary teacher at the Jewish Theological Seminary, even the head of it at one point. So his leadership in that area very much helped shape and form the place of social action and social justice. He wrote a whole 2-volume section on the prophets, which is a very important read, I would say. So that's another important piece of this. Any last items here, things that I didn't cover, things that that you would like to hear more about? I'll respond just very quickly to a question Ben asked me in the chat, which was, said, when conservative Jews study Mishnah, do they take the same approach as modern Orthodox Jews? Do they take different liberties? Absolutely, they take different liberties. And this is all because of the positive historical approach that characterizes Judaism, that really the Mishnah, if we study a page of Talmud, we will see that the Talmud is organized around the Mishnah. The Mishnah, you have in the Talmud, you'll have a section of that's the Mishnah. You'll have a verse or whatever that is. And then you'll have all these rabbis' commentary on the Mishnah, which is called the Gemara. And it's the Gemara, the commentary, and the Mishnah itself that makes the Talmud. But you can also study Mishnah just by itself. But if you study Mishnah by itself, an Orthodox approach to Mishnah would be studying the Mishnah through the lens of the Talmud. You would understand, what does the Mishnah mean based on what those later rabbis of the Talmud understood it to mean. So for instance, if you get a copy of the Mishnah, which is, for example, Pinchas Kahati, the Kahati Mishnah. The Kahati Mishnah, or anything you would find from Art Scroll, will give their commentary on what the Mishnah means through the eyes of the Gemara, through those later rabbis' eyes. Whereas in the conservative approach, how we studied it in seminary, and how I would imagine that Reform students would also study it, is to study Mishnah on its own accord. What was going on historically in that time and place, the first century, the rabbis who are bringing that first century? How do you understand that through their own perspective? And that would be a place that, it's not that it doesn't take into account. The conservative approach would definitely take into account how the Talmud viewed it, but would acknowledge that that's not necessarily what the Mishnah means, just what the Talmud has to say, or the rabbis in the Talmud. It would take it on its own accord, in its own context. The other piece that I will say that comes into this place of studying text is what's called biblical criticism, which is, again, we're talking about the conservative perspective, is that this was written by people, and the study of sacred texts from a biblical critical place looks at even the Torah itself was created by many different authors at different times with different agendas. That there's a J and an E and a P and a D, which are all these letters to talk about these whole schools that had different agendas within the Jewish community at that time that they wanted to teach. And you had an editor or a series of editors over time that wove together these different authorships into this one text that we have as the Talmud. So what does it mean to look at a text that way? Well, it means that when you're trying to understand, why does it say this in one place and why does it say this in another place? Well, you can take the approach of the Midrash or the rabbis that uses that disparity, that says, well, the Torah all came from Sinai, it came from God. So the disparity must mean to teach something deeper. And what is that deeper teaching that we have? And the rabbis could teach about something mystical or something ethical or something whatever to resolve that disparity. Or you could look from a biblical critical place and say, wow, that disparity is the result of different authors that had different agendas. And, I'll find that particular, while I find that approach to be fascinating and maybe even historically accurate, it doesn't do a whole lot for being able to be spiritually inspired or growing by having that be the explanation for the disparities. I don't find that biblical criticism gives a whole lot of inspiration, but it does help inform and deepen and make more rich the Torah experience itself and how God's revelation comes through different people in different times and how it gets woven together. Okay, I think that's a place where we'll stop. I feel like I could go on this topic for a long time because it's endlessly fascinating. Thank you, everybody, for hanging in there and for your questions. And really appreciate this learning space. I will say that in 2 weeks, we'll have another World of Judaism class, which is really looking at Jewish sacred text. This is another really fundamental foundation class to try to understand who are the characters in Jewish sacred text. What are the classical texts? How are texts studied? Really kind of getting the lay of the land to understand a little bit about kind of the richness of how our tradition works and gets interpreted. Take care, everybody. Have a good rest of your week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Is there another class on this subject, or is this just self-contained?
This is self-contained.
Oh, okay.
There is, I just want to say two things coming up is on Thursday, there is a lunch and learn with me. If you want to talk more about this stuff or anything else from 12:30 to 1, get your lunch and we can talk about anything you want. Conservative, Reform, Temple Bethel, God, the meaning of life, whatever it is. That's from 12:30 to 1. And then this Friday night will be a kibbutz and community session before services. Log on at 5 o'clock to get to be with people virtually, talk. Really nice way to come into Shabbat and break the isolation of this time.
Don't
All right,
forget
good night,
to
everybody.
contribute to Thanksgiving Interfaith Families Forward. If you could buy some food for those families in need, there's a link on the website. Just wanted to plug that.
Yeah, it's very